The last few months have been difficult for Harvard Business School and for Harvard. For many, the attacks on 10/7 and the war in Gaza afterwards, and the recent tragedies facing the Israeli and Palestinian people have been felt deeply and viscerally. For everyone, the history is complex and the issues are complicated. Today's discussion is about educating ourselves on these issues. Because in the words of one of today's panelists, Dean Amani Jamal, this is where universities can play a unique role. They can, as she wrote in a recent co-authored New York Times op-ed, and I quote, state hard truths and clarify critical issues. They must train the leaders of tomorrow to think creatively and boldly, countering speech that is harmful, modeling civil dialogue, mutual respect and empathy, and showing an ability to listen to one another. End of quote. So it is listening, what I call active listening, that I want to encourage you to do today. Approach this conversation with open-mindedness and a commitment to empathy and learning. Absorbing multiple points of view, particularly those that are different from your own, is the best way to begin to navigate uncertainties and deepen understanding. I expect you will hear things with which you disagree this afternoon. I urge you to look at these moments as I do, as a gift, an opportunity to learn about a different perspective and to challenge assumptions and preconceptions.
And I thought I would start by trying to get our panel to help us pick through some of these accounts, to figure out how we can come to our own considered view of the events of October 7th and what has come since. So there can't be any reasonable disagreement about that what happened on October 7th was deeply inhuman and unjustifiable. But there's a lot of disagreement about why it happened. So no disagreement that, or there shouldn't be any reasonable disagreement about what happened, but there's disagreement about why it happened. I was listening to the podcaster Sam Harris the other day, and Sam Harris said, look, this is very simple. You know, people like who have PhDs overly complicate it. What we observed on October 7th, these atrocities, were the direct and straightforward result of a radical jihadist ideology. Okay. Now others, you know, who aren't seeking to justify what happened will say, well, that's overly simplistic, and that really what happened is a straightforward result of 16 years of siege of Gaza and 56 years of occupation. So we have these two narratives. How do we figure out which of them is right, or are they both wrong?
You know, I think we don't want to oversimplify on either side, right? So let's just look at what was the status of the conflict before October 7th, right? So you have the Gaza Strip. It's been under siege for 16 years. We know that the living conditions in Gaza are very extraordinarily difficult. We were surveying, Khalil is our partner on the Arab Barometer, we were surveying on the West Bank and Gaza right before October 7th. And literally what we found within that 3-week period before October 7th is that 75% of Gazans said that they couldn't afford to feed their families in the 30 days before, in the last month. So that's 3 out of every 4 Gazans basically struggling to feed their children. Gaza is a densely populated area. It is locked. It does not control its water, does not control its electricity, it does not control its Wi-Fi. The entire strip is controlled by Israel, more or less. It also relies on about anywhere between 300 to 400 trucks of aid per day. So when we hear that 20 trucks of aid were entered into Gaza through Rafah as an accomplishment in this crisis, it's not even scratching the surface in terms of the actual need there. So under good conditions, daily life in Gaza is unbearable. This has been documented year in and year out by the human rights organizations, by Palestinians themselves, by journalists who are in Gaza. So for us who've studied this conflict for 20 years, if you sort of just look at the trend line, every 3 to 5 years we see bubbling up in Gaza, just because of the conditions of Gaza. What we haven't seen is October 7th, the atrocities linked to October 7th. And, you know, why did this happen? Why did they go deep into, why did Hamas go deep into Israel? Why did they, you know, quote unquote, overreach in this extent of, if this was a military campaign, why bring in the civilians? Things that we haven't seen before. That's all we can sort of bracket that, because we don't want to sort of assign assumptions there. Nevertheless, if we're sort of asking about the condition of Gaza and the bubbling of Gaza, this has been a trend, an ongoing trend.
Yeah. David, you know, I mean, am I wrong in thinking that these are the two narratives that seem to be competing for attention in the kind of wider, you know, public opinion sphere? And, Dean Jamal points out that they're both kind of wrong. So what is the right account?
Well, I read I don't see what happened on October 7th as an intifada, a mass uprising. There's a whole context of the history, which I'm sure we can get into. I wrote a book on Oslo. The first thing they agreed on was Israel wants to get out of Gaza. 1994, turn it over to the Palestinian Authority. 2005, pull out all the settlers. Which for Israel was a big deal to do that. And people thought, okay, if you don't occupy them, then they might not love you, but okay, but at least you're moving on. I think 2007, when Hamas really took over, was a watershed. And here maybe we might have some slight differences of cause and effects, because the so-called blockade was a focus on Hamas saying, we're going to still fire rockets at you. And that's what led to what it did. Now, we'll talk about the economic assumptions, I hope, in some of the other questions. I don't want to get bogged down. But I would say, I think what's important for people to understand, this was a deliberate decision-making by the Hamas leadership to do these atrocities. The people of Gaza did not commit these atrocities, not as a mass movement. It was a determined set of few at the top, who 2,000 people, whatever that number is, that did these atrocities. And in my view, they were driven by two big ideas, as I see it. One big idea was a belief that that there could be an axis of resistance of all sorts of Islamist militias, loosely affiliated on different levels, not necessarily proxies. Some are proxies. I wouldn't call Hamas a proxy of Iran, and who thought that this was a moment of ultimate weakness inside Israel. I look at Khalil, who I adore, and the best pollster, hands down, on Palestinian politics. And every trip to Ramallah, my first stop, Khalil. The key here is understanding. In his poll in September, I think it is, he said 44% of Gazans think Israel is weak and fragmented and on the verge of collapse. I think that's a direct quote. Why do they think so necessarily in 2023? Because of the divisions over the judicial overhaul issue. You had pilots who said they wouldn't serve in reserve duty, special forces, soldiers. If I was an Arab looking inside Israel, I would say, if there's ever going to be an attack, it's going to be in 2023 because of this sense of fragmentation. Now, in my view, it was a terrible misreading, a terrible miscalculation, because Israel will unite in a time of crisis, as it is done. But also the poll in Israel Democracy Institute, 70% of Israelis interpret what happened here as a sense of the timing. We're talking about the timing now. Why now? Was because of a sense of an interpretation of Israeli weakness. If you look at Mohammed Def, the Hamas commander, what he says the day of the 7th, this is the time for all the axis of resistance to join the fight. He said that in an audio message. On October 15th, Abu Marzouk, Khalid Mashal goes on television and says, basically, Hezbollah, what you've done is nice, but not enough. The battle requires more. There's a sense of disdain that here we're doing it. Where is everybody? We thought we were doing it for the whole axis, and none of you guys are shown up.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, reason one. The second reason I would give that I see, and everyone I know, I talk to in the Arab world, Israel, the White House, the State Department, they all believe this, is that this was an effort to thwart a mega deal of the United States, led by the Biden administration, with Saudi Arabia, which would be what I call a mega deal, a U.S.-Saudi defense treaty, but part of that deal to get two-thirds of the Senate for an actual treaty, which requires two-thirds, was a Saudi-Israeli normalization. Now, if you're a rejectionist group like Hamas, you might say, if the Saudis make peace with Israel, now that Egypt has done it, Jordan has done it, the United Arab Emirates has done it. There's also been other countries, Morocco, Bahrain, but those are the key ones. If Saudi does it, it's game over. Yeah. And so I think part of it was to thwart it, maybe to trigger a big retaliation that would be seen on every Arab television screen in Saudi Arabia and in the Arab world. So I think, to me, when you say, why now? Why is the timing now? I would say this was a deliberate decision of Hamas, looking both internally inside Israel and looking at the Biden administration's priorities for a major regional initiative that was going to be its signature policy and going on now in the coming months.
Okay, so that's very helpful in terms of trying to understand Hamas's decision-making at this particular moment. I kind of think that my question is a little bit, maybe even a little bit more basic than that. Where I'm trying to understand is if the state that this conflict is in right now was inevitable, right? Because both of these narratives kind of suggest, one of them suggests that as long as you have Hamas, this is the kind of thing that will happen because it is just hell-bent on killing Jews or eliminating the state of Israel. And then there's another account that's basically saying, actually, the whole reason that Hamas is behaving this way, the whole reason that we're in the situation that we're in is because of a set of policies over the last 16, over the last 50 years, whatever, that, not just immiserate Palestinians, as Professor Jamal has pointed out, but maybe even undermine moderates and allow radicals like Hamas to get the upper hand. So I guess that's the question I think lots of people who are reading this, lots of my students, these are the accounts that they're trying to grapple with. Khalil Shiqaqi, can you help us, adjudicate between them?
Sure, I can try. I think there are three questions here. One is the overall environment. Was this overall environment leading in this direction or not? The second is the Hamas decision-making. And the third is the timing. These are three separate issues, but perhaps the most fundamental is the first. I'll quote the Jordanian foreign minister who said, Hamas did not invent the conflict invented Hamas. Since the Oslo process started, we have seen Israelis and Palestinians trying to reach an end to the conflict, a two-state solution. The current Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, is the same government that has been trying for most of the last 16 years to create conditions or to support conditions that have essentially prevented any progress in that direction. Hamas was very instrumental in providing that kind of environment. The Palestinian division means there is no serious discussion about a two-state solution or ending the conflict. And so Israel and Hamas found themselves in the same bed for the last 16 years. Hamas has been nourished by this logic, the logic of how to prevent a two-state solution from coming about. That is why Hamas became stronger and stronger, because the Netanyahu governments have done their best to make sure that the Palestinians remain divided and that there is no serious discussion about ending the Israeli occupation. This is the source of all evil in this whole story, that there is occupation that we are not able to get rid of, and the Palestinians want to get rid of that. But then there is Hamas decision-making. The Hamas decision-making cannot be read without looking at the history of these 16 years. What has Hamas been trying to do during these 16 years? We can't just look at what Hamas is saying today, as you have done, David, as an explanation for their behavior. We have already 16 years of their control over Gaza, in which we can see what direction they have been trying to find a solution to their own predicament. They have been in Gaza since 2007, controlling Gaza. They took over Gaza violently from the Palestinian Authority. But since then, they've been trying to figure out a way out, an exit for them out of the predicament they put themselves in. And the initial impulse was to have a mini-state in Gaza of their own for the time being, and that state of a mini-state would have access through Egypt. This is why they had hundreds of tunnels underneath Egypt, underneath the Gaza-Egypt borders, so that they can have a kind of political economy that can sustain that kind of outcome, a mini-state in Gaza. That's what they have done between 2007 and 2014. In 2014, with Sisi in power, Sisi closed down 99% of the tunnels that the previous regime or regimes allowed in place. With that completely destroyed, the idea of a mini-state was destroyed. And the Hamas started to look for an alternative strategy. The alternative exit for them was through going back to the Palestinian Authority, allowing the reunification of the West Bank and Gaza. And now we have a period between 2014 all the way until 2021 with new Hamas leaderships that have in fact done everything in its power to give the Palestinian Authority everything the Palestinian Authority asked for, so that the West Bank and Gaza can be reunified. Sinwar, the man who led this last offensive, is the man who gave Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, everything that Abbas wanted so that he could reunify the West Bank and Gaza, and Abbas failed. In April 2021, Abbas canceled the elections that were Sinwar's means of getting to the reunification, so that Hamas can be reintegrated once again into the Palestinian formal political process. That was Sinwar's way out. That was different from those who actually carried out the violent takeover of Gaza, whose goal was a mini-state in Gaza through Egypt. Abbas destroyed that option. Sisi destroyed the first, and it was Abbas who destroyed the second. Between 2021 all the way until October the 6th, Sinwar's eyes looked at Netanyahu and Israel. And not just Netanyahu, but also the two previous prime ministers before Netanyahu, Lapid and Bennett, for a third exit. And the third exit was to go back to the idea of a mini-state, that now Hamas has come to the conclusion that Abbas cannot be trusted, and he is not going to allow the reunification of the West Bank and Gaza. They have to have their own mini-state in Gaza. But instead of Egypt being the exit, Netanyahu and Israel became the exit. That Israel would offer them an end to the siege and blockade in return for allowing Hamas to control Gaza and maintain security for Gazans and for Israelis. This is the deal that previous Israeli government have been trying to reach with Hamas, that I think have gained significant grounds starting with late 21. With the formation of the most extreme Israeli government early this year, Sinwar's goal of reaching a mini-state in Gaza was completely demolished, and he now was left without any way out. The most difficult part for the Israeli government was how to give Sinwar the legitimation needed to be able to have a mini-state in Gaza. And that legitimation was a huge success in releasing Palestinian prisoners. The issue of Palestinian prisoners has been the most fundamental issue of legitimacy for any Palestinian leader. That's what Sinwar wanted. He could not get that with the kind of prisoners he had before October 7. The plan for Sinwar, the offensive, was to achieve many things, but most importantly, to hurt Israel, to force it to come to the negotiating table, to have enough prisoners so that he can have a huge success in releasing prisoners so that the West Bank will give him legitimacy to have a mini-state in Gaza. Gazans wanted a mini-state. West Bankers rejected it completely. Having that kind of success would have given Sinwar what he wanted. The timing was affected by the Saudi deal. He did not want the Saudis and the Israelis to reach a deal, leaving him hanging in limbo.
Yeah.
He was influenced by what was happening in Israel, the judiciary. He was influenced by what was happening in the West Bank, the rise of armed groups, because Israel was sending its army to the West Bank rather than defending its own borders in Gaza.
Yes.
That is the timing, but it has nothing to do with the fundamental goals of what Hamas has been trying to do for 16 years.
So that's really very important, because you've offered a narrative of Hamas basically as a rational actor whose goal is to try to set up a mini-state in Gaza and having the door slammed shut by the Egyptians.
Israel treated it exactly like that for 16 years. This is not a new narrative. This is how Israel dealt with Hamas for 16 years.
Yeah. Shai, is that, do you sign on to the narrative or the analysis offered by your co-author?
You put me on the spot here. So first of all, I want to say this. I think that we have to differentiate between general conditions that allow a development to take place and the specific circumstances that affect the timing, and they're not the same.
Right.
I think that, put it this way, Israel's position on Hamas is, and by the way, I could proceed everything I say by saying I agree with my first three panelists. I think every one of them had a piece of the truth. But the problem is that this is a very complex story, and it's not very easy to basically identify which parts are, or at least which parts I agree with and which not. I think that it goes back to your first two narratives. You cannot look at this without giving at least some weight to the fact that Israel was dealing with a neighbor that ideologically was committed to Israel's destruction. And it never changed its narrative. It's not the PLO. The PLO gradually from 1974 through the phase plan to 1988, the Declaration of Independence, then Oslo, it gradually changed its narrative. And it made the relationship between the Palestinians, led by the PLO, and Israel no longer a zero-sum game. Hamas has never gone through this same journey. And the problem is that Israel weighed then all these issues regarding, for example, the so-called siege. Israel weighed this issue of siege through this prism of the fact that it landed with a neighbor, and I'll get to whether that neighbor also was a convenient tool for a certain narrative in Israel, but a neighbor that was committed to Israel's destruction. So some of the things that Israel accepted when it dealt with the PLO, in 1998, President Clinton came to Gaza and inaugurated an international airport and the beginning of a port in Gaza. Okay? the minute that Hamas took over, and we have to remember, this is somehow a plurality of Palestinians voted for Hamas in the 2006 elections. And then the same Hamas took over Gaza Strip violently from the PA. Israel handed the Gaza Strip to the PLO in the framework of the Oslo Accords. Okay? Now it faced that part of the Palestinian body politic that did not accept Israel's existence, ruling Gaza. So the issue here was that completely contextualized differently the Israeli internal debate about what to do with Gaza. Because how could Israel allow, for example, a port in favor of what? An entity that's committed to Israel's destruction? Now you see, without a port and without an airport, look at the amount of weapons and ammunition that despite the lack of port and the lack of an airport, Hamas was able to assemble. Now imagine that they could also bring all the stuff through a port and an airport. Okay? This is a prism that you cannot ignore. It was there. Now, it's true, by the way, that Israel had a government for the last 12 years that, let's put it this way, mildly, was not crazy about a two-state solution. And having a neighbor like Hamas, I agree, at least in part, because I don't think that that's like the mother of all evils. But yes, for Israelis who were arguing against the two-state solution, it was convenient to be able to point to the fact that, by the way, that not only was Hamas in ruling Gaza, but all efforts to reconcile Hamas and the PA have failed. Arab countries, one after the other, tried to play a role in internal Palestinian reconciliation, and all of these efforts failed. So now we go back to the general conditions that don't answer the question of specifics, because I do think that actually, again, you had some of the answers already, including the issue of the Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement that was almost there. But I think the Saudi-Israeli normalization that was almost there was part of a much bigger phenomena. And the bigger phenomena was Palestinian fatigue. Everybody was tired of the Palestinians. Everybody was tired of the Palestinian problem, and so on and so forth. So before we had this normalization, we had two Arab states that signed agreements in the framework of the Abraham Accords with Israel that dropped the conditionalities of the previous Arab Peace Initiative and basically signed the agreements with Israel without any reference to the Palestinian issue. And that was after Israel already had peace treaties with Jordan and with Egypt that lasted for decades without the conditionalities of something. So what do I learn from all of this? I learn from all of this is that if you neglect the Palestinian issue, it's going to blow in your face. And so we have to remember we have the general environment that was the environment for this kind of disaster happening, and what I call the match. Yeah. Okay, the Saudi Peace Initiative may have been a match. It's exactly the same of what happened in the beginning of the Second Palestinian Intifada. The conditions, which is to say the failure to make any progress in Israeli-Palestinian peace, was all there. Okay, and what you needed is then Israeli leader Sharon, at that time in the opposition, going up to Temple Mount, which is of course a hypersensitive issue. He supplied the match.
Yes.
But he didn't create the general environment.
Yes. Okay, so I want to move to another set of questions. But before we get off this, I want to present to Amani and then to David just some narratives that I think were embedded in Shai's answer. So what do you say, Dr. Amani, to somebody who says, look, Gaza hasn't been occupied by Israel since 2007. Hamas could have made Gaza in 2005, could have made it into a Singapore. They didn't. And instead, what did they do? They invested in rockets that they could lob at Israel. Isn't that a pretty good illustration of what this movement is about?
Yeah, well, so let me sort of break down a few things.
Yeah.
I didn't talk as long as everybody else, so just give me some breathing room here.
100%.
So first of all, I want to talk
But you are much better than us.
I know, well, I mean, no. The siege, right? I mean, the logic behind the siege is basically a security argument for Israel. I think that argument has fallen on its face. The siege can last, it can be economically strangling. Those weapons are still coming in, those missiles. We're seeing in Gaza things that were beyond the imagination, right? Drones, paragliders, whatever. I mean, I never studied war and the bombs or oil. I'm like civic engagement, democratization type of person. But what we're seeing, for somebody who studied Palestinian civil society, we've never seen this level of sophisticated weaponry and missiles and launchers everywhere and tank things that blow up tanks. So the siege is not working. So then the question is, why is this population of 2.2 million people, 2.3 million people under economic siege? You cannot develop Gaza into a Dubai or Singapore under the conditions of the siege. So that's first. And we can come back and talk about this in a little bit more detail. But I want to talk about two other things, just in terms of keeping the debate going. The West Bank. I'm from the West Bank. And in 1989, we, the Palestinians, we denounced terrorism, we recognized the state of Israel, and we entered into a peace process that should have resulted in a two-state solution. The Palestinian Authority was created to honor that peace agreement. Fast forward, almost quarter of a century later, on the West Bank, we had, at the eve of Oslo, we had 100,000 settlers on the West Bank. Today we have 750,000. At a population of 2.5 million, about a third of the population on the West Bank right now are Israeli settlers that are armed. You know, I just talked to my mom, and she's like, Mom, the settlers are just coming around and destroying everybody's homes in the Palestinian territories. So while, and people say Israel, Israel, I just, you know, as somebody has always heard people say, oh, all the Muslims and all the Palestinians. No, the Benjamin Netanyahu government, we had an Israeli left and an Israeli peace camp that worked with the Palestinians to advance the Oslo Accords. So it's not all of Israel. And Shai is one of them on the Israeli side. It is Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm nostalgic for the peace process. And I was watching Shattered Dreams, you know, about the failure of the talks the other day. It's online, it's free, watch it. But one of the common features in that documentary about the destruction of the peace process is Benjamin Netanyahu, since 2002, coming to the stage and basically saying, we don't want peace with the Palestinians. We can accomplish our goals on the West Bank, give them Area A, which are like little enclaves, and we can expand the settlements on the West Bank. As a Palestinian, when I go home every summer, I'll tell you the West Bank has shrunk. If you haven't been to the West Bank, it's probably not the best time to go now, but look at the satellite imagery. So when we even want to even, you know, you sort of say Hamas did not denounce terrorism, did not recognize Israel. Like, has anybody, like, what Hamas has done repeatedly is make fun of the Palestinian Authority as like the losers and the sellouts and the weaklings, because they did what the international community asked them to do, the civilized thing, which is recognize Israel, denounce terrorism, demilitarize, and still nothing. Who let's just forget about Israel right now, and there's an Israeli left that has also been sort of pushed aside by what's going on. We have a leader in Israel who is trying to reverse democracy so that people cannot really express their opinions. There are protests in Tel Aviv by Israelis calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to step down, but also the end of the atrocities in Gaza. So this is much more complicated. It's not like, oh, we're black and white here, or here and there. There was a peace camp of Israelis and Palestinians working together that was sabotaged by the right wings on both. Hamas on the one hand, but with all due respect, the right wing Netanyahu coalition right now that is calling for the eradication of Arabs from the West Bank and Gaza is also sort of not recognizing Palestinians' right to exist, Palestinian human rights, Palestinians' rights to stay on the land. We're in a moment in our history, when you ask about how we got to October 7th, look who's dominating the conflict. Now back to the West Bank. Mahmoud Abbas, we have not seen Palestinian elections since 2006. Why? Because there's this fear that Mahmoud Abbas will lose. That is another authoritarian government. There were negotiations to bring in Hamas into the fold of the Palestinian Authority, where it would have to honor the agreements of the Palestinian Authority. Khalid didn't mention this part, which means that they would have to subscribe to denouncing terrorism and recognizing Israel de facto by participating in the Palestinian Authority coalition. Is this correct? Or there was willingness for them to be subsumed under that Palestinian Authority agreement. We can come back to the details of that.
Yeah.
But that did not move forward because Mahmoud Abbas did not want to include Hamas, which also talks about the lack of Palestinian elections and authoritarianism. But finally, this idea that everybody was fatigued about the Palestinian cause. I think Arab leaders are fatigued, Arab authoritarian leaders, but there was no intifada, there was no conflict when the World Cup was held in Qatar this summer, or sorry, last winter. All of a sudden, we saw things, all of a sudden, Morocco would score a goal and the crowds would step up and start singing for Palestine. There was no conflict. Any Arab country that played well, the crowd would step up and start chanting for Palestine. It was basically on a world stage where authoritarian governments weren't limiting what citizens can say and talk about. There's a lot, our public opinion polls have shown consecutively that there's a lot of support for the Palestinian cause. Finally, and think about October 7th, let's go back to the West Bank for a moment. This whole idea, and I'm not for right or wrong, I'm just trying to contextualize what's going on. The attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque preceding these events, day in and day out, there's attacks by Israelis and Israeli settlers, by Israeli military and Israeli settlers on Palestinians praying on the temple, on Al-Aqsa, Al-Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, over and over repeatedly, and harassing Palestinians, and this has been ongoing. This was part of the culmination. Again, a West Bank that did everything that the world asked it to do. Right? Everything. And who is calling for a Palestinian state on the West Bank? Just last point. Everybody got to say this, I'm not going to get a chance to talk. Everybody talks about the failure of the peace process.
You'll definitely get a chance to talk.
I just want to say this last thing. Everybody talks about the failure of the peace process. I want to tell everybody in this audience, because I don't want our youth to be delusioned by our leaderships. There was so much progress made between Palestinians and Israelis in the peace talk. Not enough, but there was a lot. It's much better than where we are now. You had joint security. You had joint intelligence sharing. You had joint patrols. You had joint economic agreements. You had imports and exports, borders. There was a lot of work being done behind the scenes, and my colleagues all know this. They were, I was younger. They were the hope. They were giving us the hope of the future. And then they came to Camp David. They couldn't finalize the deal over some important details around Jerusalem. And then everybody said, oh, peace failed. It did not fail. It needed another few more rounds. Yeah. And nobody came back to bring those groups back together. Which U.S. administration since then? Yes, Obama tried a little bit here, but even with the Biden administration, now they're calling for two states. But has any American administration seriously been committed to the project of giving Palestinians dignity and self-determination on the West Bank?
That's an important question that we should all talk about. David, so I want to note two things. I have 7 more minutes for the part of this where we get to talk, and I have 17 more questions, which I will not ask. But David, I want to get you to respond to something that appeared both in Shai's answer and in Amani's answer, which is really that we have to blame, or there has to be a reckoning with the conduct of the Netanyahu government that may have kept Hamas in power. So there was a story in Haaretz by Adam Raz last month. He says, for 14 years, Netanyahu's policy was to keep Hamas in power. And it reports that in 2019, Hamas said to a group of Likud MPs, Whoever opposes a Palestinian state must support delivery of funds to Gaza because maintaining separation between the PA and the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza will prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So what's your response to that narrative?
You got to give me 2 minutes.
I'll give you 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
No,
but yeah, okay.
No, because Amani and I see things differently. And I'd say with respect, I'm someone who I think has devoted my professional life. I want a two-state solution. I want dignity for both sides. Where I think the narratives are going to diverge, and I think it's important that people understand to add to your layer of complexity and to make it challenging for these students who are listening and trying to absorb this, is for the United States, there were 3 mega efforts to end this conflict, not to manage it, not stabilize it, end it. And it was Clinton at Camp David in the 6 months of 2000. There was an effort of Condoleezza Rice in 2007 and 8. And there was an effort I was a part of in the Obama administration under Secretary of State Kerry, where we devoted 9 months to a lot of these details. And I think that if you don't understand how the U.S. wanted to end the conflict and had the Israeli governments with us, by the way, in this regard, then you're missing it. We lost the Israeli peace camp not because they fell out of the wrong side of the bed, but between 2000 and 2004, the intifadas, where you had over 100 suicide bombs. And by the way, Palestinians were killed too.
David, if I may, but that was 20 years ago.
No, ma'am,
Yeah, 20 years, that's 2 decades.
I'm not,
we
it
have
doesn't
to
end
revive.
there. No,
Okay.
I agree. But I'm saying was where we lost the peace camp, where the train went off the rails, was they said, look, Ehud Barak and all the Clinton, these were efforts to end this conflict. And then you had over all these suicide bombings, and the peace camp was never revived after 4 years of a second intifada. The intifada was devastating. But we kept trying anyway. And that's why the effort of Condi Rice, 38 rounds with Olmert and Abbas. And then the effort we in the Obama administration tried of 9 months on trying to solve what we call final status issues, the 4 issues. And, you know, I remember Abbas, March 17th, 2014, you know, I'll never forget this day for the rest of my life because he promised our president, President Obama, I'll get you an answer. I know you've worked very hard on this, Mr. President. Give me a week. I'll get back to you. All right? And so it's not exactly accurate. We never got an answer to any of this. The problem with Bibi was with 2019, and I'm sorry to all these dates because this is not ancient history, 2019. Right. What you had was...
They're much younger than we are.
Okay,
so,
they're younger. Okay. But in 2019, basically the UN, working with the Qataris and the Egyptians and the United States and Israel, was trying to say, look, nobody is offering money to Gaza. Here, the Qataris are willing to do it, $30 million. It's going for food stamps for the UN World Food Program. It's going for a power plant. It's going for fuel. These were substantive efforts. And it was also based on a reassessment that was going on in Israeli intelligence agencies and was going on at the White House and at the State Department that says maybe Hamas has taken a hard edge off of ideology. Let's get workers in there to go into Israel. Let's bring money into Gaza. Let's try to see if we could use more carrots, less sticks, something that would take an edge off the ideology. Because where I think Khalil and I might have a respectful disagreement is, for me, the rejectionism of Hamas was not a detail. It was at the core. I mean, when basically you have Marzouk going on Russian TV saying, I don't have to build shelters, that's not my job, I build tunnels for our fighters. Or, you know, Chia going to the New York Times this month saying, our job, we didn't do this for economics, we don't accept Israel under any borders. So, I mean, there's a real problem of the rejectionism. It is at the center. They're not trying to get a two-state, a mini-state. That was the hope, that was the assumption of the last several years that economics could have an impact. And sadly, a lot of the workers that went in were the people that gave details on where to massacre people. It's such a terrible tragedy. And I'm not saying they were all Hamas agents. I'm saying maybe Hamas squeezed these 17,000 workers. Here, this one is children, this has cats, this has dogs, the kids live in this room, kill here. So, I mean, it was a very difficult thing. Is Bibi absolved? No, he's not absolved. That's also part of the reality. But there was an effort after 4 rounds of 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, 2021 of active fighting of Hamas There was an active effort to see maybe economics could somehow jumpstart this. And then you have the Bibi factor from 2019, where he said, you know what, let some of it come in suitcases. Because he was facing an election. There were 4 elections in a row. And he was using that moment to try to buy quiet from Hamas. And there's where I blame him. Because I think the UN food program idea then got diverted into suitcases directly for Hamas. Is Bibi the root cause of this? No way. No way. He's 5% of this. But it's a 5% that has to be fixed. And it's a 5% that has to be addressed to give hope for 2 states. When this war is over, so we have dignity for both sides.
So I want to take questions from the audience, but I wanted to get to the second part of tonight's agenda, which is to talk about ways out. Okay, so we are now facing a humanitarian crisis of extraordinary proportions. What is happening in Gaza right now, by some accounts, if you believe the Gazan Ministry of Health, you know, it's by at least their measure, more Gazan civilians have been killed in the last 6 weeks than Ukrainian civilians have been killed since February 2022. I know people can argue about that number. Nobody will argue that a lot of civilians are not dying. So the question is, how do we get out of this? And I guess for you, Shai Feldman, I would ask, what does success look like for the Netanyahu government in this campaign? And then what ideas do we have for how we get out of this? In 30 seconds.
So the Netanyahu government is very, very, very clear about what its objectives now are. And the first one is eradicating Hamas's fighting capability and governing capacity. That's one. And B is freeing the 239 hostages that Hamas is still holding. These are the 2 objectives of this operation. What does it mean now for the next weeks or so? I don't know, because we are getting into, the more successful the IDF is in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, the more the dilemmas are going to, Israel will have big dilemmas to face with respect to what Israel does in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Because the population of Gaza is, in any case, one of the most dense in the world. And now, essentially, it's become even more dense. But, again, you know, Israel suffered a catastrophic event on October 7th. It's not going to get out of Gaza before it produces a response to this catastrophic event. I think people, even the younger people here, may remember that after 9/11, the U.S. went to the other side of the world and invaded 2 countries because you faced Al-Qaeda, who was basically butchering American civilians in New York City. And by the way, what the Second Intifada didn't do to the peace camp, October 7th did to the peace camp, okay? Because all the communities in the South were people who actually were part of the Israeli peace camp, okay? And they were butchered. So we have to remember that. There's no going away from October 7th, okay? And we are still in what we call the event. We are still in the event called October 7 and its aftermath. Now, the second dilemma that Israel will face, of course, is if it succeeds in its 2 objectives, is what does it do with the Gaza Strip? Okay? Now, my view about this is very clear. It's similar to President Biden. Israel signed with the PLO the Oslo Accords. The first implementation agreement was the Gaza Strip, and Jericho was given to the PLO, okay? Hamas, by the way, we forget about that. When Hamas won the 2006 elections and the first national unity government was forged, the European Union basically presented the 3 preconditions. Hamas refused all of them. Not to recognize, they did not recognize Israel, they didn't sign they were not willing to, and they were not willing to accept the agreements that the PLO signed before them. Okay, so this didn't start afterwards. Now, if Hamas, by the way, had a strategy in 2006 of wanting a Palestinian state, they had an option, and the option was because remember that when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, Israel withdrew not only from Gaza but from 4 settlements in the northern part of the West Bank. Did that change the situation in the West Bank? No. Why did Sharon do it? To signal to the other side, this is not Gaza first and last. We will disengage from the West Bank. But for that, Hamas had influence on the Israeli learning curve. Yeah. And instead of saying, okay, now let's teach the Israelis that they can safely withdraw, okay, as long as we get our Palestinian state. What happened after 2005, after Israel withdrew? The rockets started flying. What's the Israeli... So you can understand now, after we see what happened after Israel withdrew from Lebanon in 2000, in May 2000, look at what 150,000 rockets and missiles that Hezbollah now has. And by the way, it's reminding us every day now, with increased intensity. Now, and Hamas, that's what it did. It reminded now what was the conclusion of the Israelis. Why did the right wing win these elections? The right wing won the elections because the Israelis accepted the narrative that if Israel withdraws unilaterally, that's what it gets.
If you didn't like the book, you'd hate the movie.
Yeah.
Well,
No, please.
really quick. And Hamas won because what part of the platform was because of the failure of the peace process to produce results on the ground as well, right? So the failure of
and
the
it
peace
also
process,
won because of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority.
100%.
But we can't solve everybody's problems.
But the problem is that the failure of the peace process has emboldened both the right wing and Hamas. Yeah. So we're in October 7th, 100%, but this has been decades in the making. That's what I'm trying to say. And if we wanted to look at that bell curve once where we had Israelis and Palestinians on the same peace path, let's look at the conditions underlying that momentum. Yeah. We can sit here and say how horrible the right wing is in Israel, how horrible Hamas is. Nobody's. I don't see anybody defending Hamas or the right wing. But what happens from here on? Sorry.
Thank God for that.
Well, but where we go from here is going to be very instrumental.
Yeah, of course.
Let the record show, in fact, that my question was about where we go from here, and we immediately went back to talking about the history, which just illustrates, I think, how thorny some of this is. We will now come to the most important part of the evening, which is questions from this.
He didn't get his fourth.
We're not doing a census here. This is. I will not be able to exit this room with the goodwill of the audience if I do not give them a chance to ask questions. And so I will start with this person over here. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for coming and speaking with us. When I listen to the panel, I hear about 2 societies and at least two state actors in those societies that don't recognize the legitimacy of the other society. And Dr. Jamal, you talked about that within these societies, there are many who want to live together. We have a 2-phase process. First, to remove the obstacle of those who don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the other. How do we do that? Who should we look to? And how should we, from here, what should we learn to support the people who want to come together and want to remove the obstacles?
Right.
Thank you so much.
Answer really quickly, succinctly. You are the students of Harvard. You are the future. Can you tell me how many peace groups are on campus? Okay, that's where you guys are going to be influencing policy. You guys need to start talking about peace and bringing peace. This is what the 2-state solution in Oslo started with conversations. Palestinians sneaking into Israel to meet with Israeli homes, and Israelis sneaking into the West Bank to meet in Palestinian homes. You guys don't have to sneak around here. You have free speech, number 1. Number 2, about eliminating the other. This is about strategy. So, right, one argument will say, let's just keep dropping bombs. I will say, my opinion is based on sort of setting this conflict. If violence was going to solve this conflict, it would have been solved by now. Violence breeds violence. What I would rather see are policies and efforts And a Palestinian Authority, if we could get elections where efforts that basically make the message of peace and reconciliation far more attractive, right, than any other message. On the Israeli side, I want to see, also would like to see in Israel where the benefits of peace are far more advantageous than the eradication of the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. And where does this start? This starts really, it starts with people seeing tangible changes on the ground, but also political leaders to step up and basically sanction their leaders when they're espousing violence and vitriol and hatred and the dehumanization of the other. We, and I've said this over and over, we have been victims of this conflict since we were born. We would love to turn the page and just be able to live with peace and dignity as Israelis, as Palestinians.
Yeah. Tremendous. Okay, I'll take a question here.
Hey, first of all, thank you all for coming here today. Really appreciate that. I do want to start with a short comment.
Please, my friend, we're almost out of time, so no comments, just a question.
Okay, just a question. So there have been some statements on this stage tonight equating Hamas with the Netanyahu government, which I didn't vote for, right?
The Netanyahu government.
But my question is this. So the State Department of the US classifies Hamas as a terrorist organization and the Netanyahu government as an ally. Do you think they're making a terrible mistake? And that's for
So I won't
Jamal
disagree with you.
and
Hamas is a terrorist
rest.
organization. I'm not defending, nobody's defending Hamas. I'm just saying that you have a right-wing government in Israel that is also calling for the eradication of Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza. So I'm not saying they're equitable. Hamas is a terrorist group. Let's not debate about that. But but you can't have a ruling coalition that's talking that has people advocating for the killing of Arabs on the West Bank and Gaza as well. I mean,
David, yes, quickly.
I just want to say really briefly, and something Shai alluded to at the very end that I was worried got lost. People say, how did the Likud come to power? And I think it's very important to understand. Are there a minority of these settlers, by the way, but a violent minority that should be thwarted? And I worry about it igniting the West Bank, and I think you and I see that very similarly, Amani. But let's be clear. The reason why the Likud, that got only 12 seats in 2006, came to power is because the public lost faith in the basic equation that we all want, which is if you withdraw, you're more secure, you're not more vulnerable. If we had rockets coming from downtown Boston on Cambridge and we couldn't solve this, we would not get the peace process people to succeed, okay? The camp of people in America that I'm very with. The equation has to be, if you withdraw, you're more secure. You're not more vulnerable. The Likud has won because people don't believe in the equation. They think we're do-gooders from Harvard University or something who really don't understand the harsh reality that Hamas will fire rockets because they are rejectionists. They don't accept Israel the size of a telephone booth on a Tel Aviv beach.
but you don't have Hamas on the West Bank.
First of all,
Hamas West Bank did not join. Hamas Gaza has been calling for Hamas West Bank to join them, and they have not.
My point is, Amani, you know this. 2005, when Israel pulled out.
No, we had the right-wing radicals who did suicide. I'm not going to argue about the history. But I am going to disagree with you, David, as a colleague, and I'm worried. I'll be honest with you. When our policymakers are saying it's a fait accompli, there was this moment in peace, and we're never going back to it because you had these suicide bombers who we denounce as terrorists. And the stories that...
the opposite.
No, you want to contextualize right-wing extremism in Israel, but you don't want to then understand then how this also contributed to the extremists in Palestine. What I'm trying to say, we need now leaders to say our youth...
Of course.
50% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were not born before, were born after the 2006 elections. We keep saying the 2006 elections, 50% were born after that election. Let's give the children of Israel and Palestine a better future. Let's get over. Yes,
I agree.
Okay.
We agree on that.
But we don't want everybody keeps saying, well, we did everything and they did.
I said we got to keep trying for two states. We should never give up because we want dignity for both. But we just have to realize that we should not demonize half of the Israeli public.
No, we're not.
Okay,
We're demanding. Is it legitimate to say that people in the Israeli coalition government?
Yes, those
The
people.
moderator is losing control of
this
this panel.
killing and eradication of Arabs.
Okay, the moderator is losing control of this panel, and he would like to reassert it. Okay, this is a great debate, and I would love it to keep happening. It's just I want to get to as many questions
Khalil
as
has
we
not said
can.
anything.
I know, Khalil is shy. Okay, please.
Thank you all for your
Brief
time. My name is Adam Schneider. I'm a joint degree law and Kennedy School student. So after this war ends and the dust settles, and God willingly soon, there's going to be another push for peace. Israel will hold elections, and almost certainly we'll have new leadership. But I think there's a real question of legitimacy right now for Palestinian Authority leadership coming to those, future peace negotiations. Boston, the 18th year of a 4-year term,
Yeah.
he doesn't have much legitimacy outside of Ramallah. What steps can the international community take to help restore PA legitimacy? And if there's an election, how do we address concerns that a repeat of 06 won't happen?
Yep.
And a group like Hamas or worse could come to power?
That's a great question. I'd love Khalil to address that.
Who told you Abbas has legitimacy in Ramallah? That's news to me. He certainly does not have legitimacy anywhere. The survey that we have done that Amani referred to in the West Bank showed 85% of West Bankers demanding his resignation. Only 6% of West Bankers were willing to re-elect him if elections are held today. There is no doubt that we need a national unity government for the Palestinians right now, one that can stabilize conditions both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and can prepare for elections. And in the meanwhile, we need to see strong leadership from this country and from the major Arab countries, particularly those that have made peace with Israel, to come up with a plan for a two-state solution that the two sides can embrace. One that will respect the needs of both sides and will respect everything, all the progress that has already been made. In that context, I can't see anyone calling for violence being able to win in Palestinian elections. Palestinians will vote for Hamas only if they think that diplomacy and negotiations are not viable and that the only way for them to end the Israeli occupation is through violence. If we can convince them that is not the case, I can't see them voting for Hamas. I can't see that problem arising to begin with. Nonetheless, if Hamas is to win, this is democracy. We have to accept that. In Israel, Israel has now the most extreme government that is thinking about bombing Gaza out of this world and annexing the entire West Bank. And we're okay with that. But if Hamas wins, we're not okay with that. That's certainly we need, if we want to be real Democrats, we have to accept if Hamas wins. Nonetheless, if we look at the history, the surveys that I've been doing throughout all these years have always indicated every time the Palestinians thought that there was a viable diplomatic path to a two-state solution that would end the Israeli occupation, they voted for those Palestinians who supported democracy and supported negotiations and a two-state solution. They only voted for Hamas when they thought that there was absolutely no way forward through diplomacy and negotiations.
Shai, I want to take the opportunity of the gentleman's question, his mention of the international community, to come to you and ask you, what role do you see the international community, the Arab countries, the United States playing in trying to get us out of the immediate catastrophe that we're in right now?
No one's going to get you out of the immediate catastrophe. The issue is, what would the day after look like? And I do think that, again, I think we have to go back to first principles. The first principle was Israel signed an agreement with the Palestinian Liberation Organization after Israel regarded that organization for decades as a terrorist organization. But it recognized the fact that the PLO went through certain changes and became a partner, and even Prime Minister Netanyahu when right at the end of one of those negotiation episodes called the Wye River negotiations in '98, there was a ceremony in the White House, and Prime Minister Netanyahu called Arafat my partner. So the issue now is, okay, so let's go back to principles. Israel agreed to hand the Palestinians gradually control over the Palestinian territories. The PLO was decided by the Arab League in 1974 as the only legitimate voice of the Palestinian people. Okay, now what does it take? Something very bad happened to the PA through these years, as Khalil is better than anybody to describe what happened there. Okay, so they can't take over right now. They can't take over because they're not legitimate and because they have no power. So the issue is it possible for, again, a coalition of countries that have some kind of a track record in relations with Israel, whether it's Egypt and Jordan and the 4 Abraham Accords countries and Saudi Arabia that was almost on the verge of normalization, to say, okay, we, for a certain period, we do 2 things. Number 1, we take over Gaza. And number 2, we will fill the shopping list of what does it take to strengthen the PA with an agreed upon timetable, after which there'll be elections, they'll elect their leaders, and so on and so forth. I want to say only one more thing about what does it take, because I think we kind of a little bit diverted. We are now faced with a disaster, the dimensions of which we have not seen since 1948. It's a disaster on the Israeli side. It's a catastrophe on the Palestinian side, in Gaza. Now, I see, and that goes back to the first of the questions that was asked, when they said, well, what can happen now? I can see, because Israel, again, with all the criticism that can be leveled against Israeli policy and Israeli leaders and so on and so forth, I can tell you that I'll race with anybody in this auditorium as to in the sport of criticizing the Israeli government. But there is one virtue, and I call it a virtue of the Israeli political system. Israel is an unforgiving country to itself. Every time it faced a catastrophe, the biggest one of this dimension was the 73 surprise. It nominates a national commission of inquiry, and if you look just the Second Lebanon War in 2006, the National Commission of Inquiry basically sacked. The political leadership was finished, and they sacked all the top echelons of the IDF for its malperformance. What will happen now, parallel to what can save Gaza, is after in the day after, there will be a major reckoning on the Israeli side, because Israel has never, ever forgave. Now, you see, the problem is this. We, and I say we, is Israelis and Palestinians, and especially we is Israel and Gaza or Hamas. We both arrived at this catastrophe. I can see a process in Israel where people, and that was the real virtue. The real virtue was not fire people who were named as liable or as to be blamed and so on and so forth. The real reckoning is to go back and re-examine your assumptions that led to a policy that led to the catastrophe. I have confidence that Israel will go through this because it's almost a national sport.
Yeah.
I wish I could be that optimistic about the Palestinians going through a similar reckoning and asking themselves, okay, but this Israeli army that came into Gaza and started leveling neighborhoods in Gaza, they didn't do it all these years. Why did they do it? Maybe we had something, which is to say we Palestinians, maybe we Hamas, had something to some responsibility in this. It didn't come out of nowhere. Because, you see, the problem is usually that, and that's the way some Europeans, other Arab countries, sometimes treat Palestinians as if they have no agency. If I were a Palestinian, I would be infuriated by this, because it's almost the Palestinians are children That you only talk to grown-ups and you don't expect anything from the children? Why? So I think that, again, my answer to the first of the questions, which was critical, is both sides have to face the fact that they both contributed to this catastrophe. And they have to, it's not a matter of, oh, we'll get rid of Abbas and we'll get rid of Bibi. No. It's the question of what was the assumptions that led to Israeli policy, what led to the Palestinians to behave the way they, and here again, look, the Palestinians have a lot to reckon with, because, and forget about what happened on October 7. 4 Arab countries that didn't sign peace treaties until then signed peace treaties with Israel and set the Palestinians aside. The Saudis themselves were that. It can't be that the Palestinians can just complain about the Arab countries as having abandoned them, betrayed them, stabbed them back in the back. Yeah. Palestinians have to, at one point, sit down and say, how did we contribute to this happening?
Ameni Jamel, I saw you nodding when he said that what's needed is self-criticism on both sides.
100%. I mean, we're not, I think we've never come here to say that Palestinians have never done anything wrong in the history, or what Hamas did was right. And if you think, with all due respect, that Israelis are infuriated, we're very infuriated by what Hamas did. We knew right away that Gaza was going to get pummeled. This was a discussion, a conversation. But these children in Gaza, again, half of them who weren't born when Hamas was elected, right? They are victims of this conflict, which is where we begin with. We're all victims of this conflict. There needs to be a lot of self-reflection. And I hope that if we can move beyond, hopefully, October 7th, and like Shai said, that moment is very catastrophic. When we get to the table, we have to allow the younger voices and their dreams and aspirations some room. Because if we're stuck on the past and talk about 2002 and 2004 and 2006, those narratives can be battled out. Yeah. But there needs to be we need to be working together as communities.
Yeah. This is great. It's now we're 2 minutes over. One thing that everybody in this hall has learned, that you never put an Egyptian in charge of anything that requires timekeeping. I just want to first thank our panelists, because you really modeled for us what vigorous debate about important issues, but that comes from a place of goodwill, looks like. So thank you for that. And I want to thank...